when I mentioned to an old friend a few months ago that I'd been asked to give this talk, that friend being an eminent scholar of Oscar Wilde, he responded, "Why, and I mean this in the nicest possible way, are they asking you?" It was a question a bit like one of the genial inquiries of a Cyril or a Vivian in one of Wilde's dialogues that spurred me to thought. Why am I speaking to you today? The two novels I've written, Tiepolo Blue and The Violet Hour, are concerned ostensibly with the art worlds of the 1990s and the present day. They're a long way, in time frame at least, from the society in which Oscar Wilde moved, the society he portrayed. I haven't depicted Wilde as a character, as for example Rupert Everett does in his recently published short story Sebastian Melmoth, imagining the fallen dandy in his final hours in Paris. Nor have I modelled my fiction closely on a given work of Wilde's, as the author Will Self did in his 2002 novel Dorian, transporting the characters and story of the Picture of Dorian Gray into a hedonistic 1980s, 1990s setting in what Self himself called a complete and professed rewrite of a classic. Everett's story and Self's novel are both examples, I suppose, of what we could call clear Wildean influence. My friend's question prompted me to wonder, in all kinds of ways, about what influence means and what it means to me. This, of course, was a question that Wilde himself grappled with all through his literary career, a question that he posed, whether in his trademark ironic style or with a sometimes disarming sincerity. In his 1891 essay, Pen, Pencil and Poison, a biographical study of the art critic and serial poisoner Thomas Wainwright, Wilde endorses Wainwright's view of the artistic temperament as something unconsciously guided and made perfect by frequent contact with the best work, going on to quip that none of us can quite free ourselves from the influence of custom and the influence of novelty. On a more personal, arrestingly candid note, in a review of the previous year, Wilde had acknowledged the influence of Walter Pater's 1873 book, Studies in the History of the Renaissance, on his own thinking. Mr. Pater's essays became to me the golden book of spirit and sense, the holy writ of beauty. They are still this to me. It is possible, of course, that I may exaggerate about them. I certainly hope that I do. For where there is no exaggeration, there is no love. And where there is no love, there is no understanding. Well, I feel today that I'm going to be channeling those sentiments of Wilde's in relation to Pater, insofar as I believe that Wilde's writing has shaped my own in ways that I could easily exaggerate. Indeed, when I talk about influence, I want to be careful not to imply a direct, conscious mode of response, certainly not a professed rewrite in the vein of Will Self, but in the main, something closer to what Wilde perceived in Thomas Wainwright, an artistic temperament unconsciously guided and improved, if not quite made perfect, as Wilde says, by frequent contact with the best work. I first read The Picture of Dorian Gray, as many people do, I think, as a teenager, and I don't think it's accidental that a book that has so much to do with the cultivation of persona, with the exhilaration and sometimes the horror of discovering life, appeals to many of us at around that age. Since then, over the years, I've taught Wilde's writings and the period of the fin de siècle more broadly, especially in relation to the import, the influence, you might say, of classical Greco-Roman art and myth in the late 19th century. So, for example, I pondered the significance of Wilde's ownership of a plaster bust of the Hermes of Praxiteles, an object that he kept in his library, or of the classical allusions that are scattered throughout the Picture of Dorian Gray. Dorian as Narcissus, Dorian as Antinous, Dorian as Apollo and Dionysus, and so on. By way of a snapshot of the classicism in which Wilde's novel is steeped, just take this hymn of praise to the young Dorian Gray by the artist Basil Hallward, who has painted his portrait. what the invention of oil painting was to the Venetians, the face of Antinous was to late Greek sculpture, and the face of Dorian Gray will someday be to me. A dream of form in days of thought. Who is it who says that? I forget, but it's what Dorian Gray has been to me. The merely visible presence of this lad, for he seems to me little more than a lad, though he's really over 20. His merely visible presence, I wonder, can you realise all that means? Unconsciously, he defines for me the lines of a fresh school, a school that is to have in it all the passion of the romantic spirit, all the perfection of the spirit that is Greek. When I come to consider Wilde's influence on me, I believe, without wanting to sound presumptuous or absurd, that it shares something of the character of Dorian's impact on Basil Hallward, although it's fair to say that I haven't felt or expressed the influence of Wilde quite as ardently as Basil does that of Dorian. Note how Dorian's classical charm has for Basil both precise and diffuse manifestations. There's the young man's compelling presence on the one hand, and his intangible spirit on the other, which is perhaps the more significant quality. A dream of form in days of thought. Basil goes on to claim of Dorian Gray that he is never more present in my work than when no image of him is there. To the extent that Wilde has influenced me, and I believe that he has profoundly, it has been in a double sense. That is, the influence has occurred at times explicitly, consciously on my part, but more generally as an unconscious process, at the level of what we might call intertextual resonance, rather than clear-cut allusion. And so, in today's lecture, I want to look not only, or not principally, at explicit references to Wilde's writing in my novels, but to think about deeper thematic resonances. To think, you might say, about the Wildean spirit, as opposed to the specific form. Of course, it's a slightly unusual thing, perhaps not quite the done thing, for a novelist to act as an interpreter of, a commentator upon, his own creations. But then there's no better rationale for the approach than Wilde's own insistence that it's false to think of the creative and critical instincts as separate from one another. The point is succinctly made in this exchange from the critic as artist. The longest of Wilde's dialogues on the nature of art and the ways in which we respond to it. To Ernest's proposal that the critical faculty is the creative faculty is higher than the critical, Gilbert, the more Wildean of the pair, retorts, the antithesis between them is entirely arbitrary. Without the critical faculty, there is no artistic creation at all, worthy of the name. My first novel, Tiepolo Blue, published in 2022, tells the story of a midlife coming of age. The protagonist, Don Lamb, is an art historian in his 40s. When we first meet him, he spent the majority of his life within the rarefied confines of the Cambridge College, Peterhouse, one of the smallest and oldest, not to mention oddest, colleges in this ancient institution. Don is an expert on the frescoes of the 18th century painter Giambattista Tiepolo. He's dedicated his life to the study of his Venetian master. In the opening scene, we encounter him as he cycles back to his college from a university library, having been reading letters from the 18th century, letters that have left a comforting sense of antiquity on his fingers. The tautology of his name has always pleased him. Donish, serious, dignified. That is how his life has been. He came to Cambridge aged 17, and over the years his consciousness has fused, like ivy eating into stone, with the town. He turned 43 this summer. Sometimes the span of time seems like nothing. His memories are entwined with the foliage of Peterhouse, with the gardens and meadows and surreptitious river. His thoughts are the mirror image of Cambridge's unchanging vistas, his mind sustained by the rituals of academic life. Don's life has been one of intense work and self-denial. Academically, he's at the height of his powers. He's written countless books, received every conceivable accolade. We've all met professors of his preeminent type. But for all his brilliance as a scholar, he remains fatally ignorant in matters of love, life, or the world. When the novel begins, Don is obsessed by the idea that he can measure the space in Tiepolo's paintings of sky, those expansive frescoes that adorn ceilings of palaces and churches all through Europe. He believes that he can distill a picture such as this into a strict classical scheme, that he can assign Vitruvian proportions and symmetries to the seemingly carefree distribution of bodies in space. Tiepolo is his enduring love. All this time he's been readying himself to write a book, the book, on that genius of 18th century Venice, the last of the old masters, the first of the moderns. Other art historians have described Tiepolo as a painter of sweetness and light, a divine choreographer. Not Don. With every picture he keeps, the ghost of the artist beckons him a little further, demanding the scholarly treatment that only Don can give. No more sweetness and light, he hears Tiepolo say. Show them how classical I am. Don is determined to locate an objective standard of beauty in the works of Tiepolo. He is, in this regard, a 1990s successor to Matthew Arnold, who famously argued in his treatise, The Function of Criticism at the Present Time, in 1865, that it is the business of the critical power to see the object as in itself it really is. Arnold was advocating here for criticism in the form of disinterested, objective scrutiny. It was an idea with which Wilde, following Walter Pater, took pointed issue in The Critic as Artist, asserting, contrary to Arnold, that critical judgment arises out of, is inseparable from, the viewer's own senses and imagination. For Wilde, the work of art becomes a prompt for the release of new ideas. The object, as it really is almost beside the point. In fact, he goes so far as to claim that the primary aim of the critic is to see the object as in itself it really is not, which is possibly to chase the idea into the realms of absurdity, as Wilde sometimes liked to do. Wilde's alter ego in the dialogue, Gilbert, maintains that when, for instance, he listens to an opera by Wagner, the work of art speaks sometimes of its direct subject, but at other times, quote, of 1,000 different things. Of myself, it may be, and my own life, or of the lives of others whom one has loved and grown weary of loving, or of the passions that man has known, or of the passions that man has not known, and so has sought for. Tonight, it may fill one with that eros tone adunatone, that amour de l'impossible, which falls like a madness on many who think they live securely and out of reach of harm, so that they sicken suddenly with the poison of unlimited desire, and, in the infinite pursuit of what they may not obtain, grow faint and swoon or stumble. Well, Don Lamb at the start of Tiepolo Blue is just one of those who thinks he lives securely and out of reach of harm. His ideas about art and beauty are a comfort blanket. They're also fatally rigid, woefully uninterrogated, to the extent that when a visiting poet at Peterhouse questions him one evening at dinner in the most friendly way about his views on art, he can hardly bear it. The mathematical lines that he draws over reproductions of Tiepolo's pictures are a kind of net, snaring him in his own doctrines. Ironically, what shocks Don out of himself, propelling him into a new life of the pleasures of the senses and the imagination, to borrow a famous phrase of Pater's, is a work of art. A work, rather as Wilde described in The Critic as Artist, that is possessed of its own marvellous or diabolical agency. In the opening chapter, Don catches sight of something on the lawn of his college, something he initially takes to be a pile of rubbish. He soon discovers that it's a contemporary installation, erected there without his knowledge, as part of a bold cultural initiative by the new master of the college, a go-getting man from the world of TV. It's called Sick Bed, and it consists of a rusting bed frame, a heap of old liquor bottles and clothes, and a flashing light. It's not unlike Tracey Emin's bed, that infamous monument to a phase of depression and drunken sex in the artist's life. Although, curiously, and I think this is crucial in terms of my theme today of resonances versus explicit references, I wasn't really thinking of Emin's bed when I conceived of Sickbed. More prominent in my mind were certain works by Emin's contemporary, Sarah Lucas, such as this or this. In any case, it won't surprise you to hear that Don doesn't react well to the arrival of Sickbed on the lawn of his college. In fact, it drives him into a mania of hostility. Over several weeks, the thing torments him, infects his thoughts and dreams. At one point, he even feels that it's chasing him with its flashing light around the course of his college, whipping him along as he walks. And this capacity for the work of art to steal into one's mind, to corrupt or obsess, has a distinctly Wildean resonance. Take the yellow-covered book that Lord Henry Wotton lends to Dorian in the Picture of Dorian Gray, that decadent tone that is said to shape Dorian's tastes and imagination indelibly. Things that he had dimly dreamed of were suddenly made real to him. Things of which he had never dreamed were gradually revealed. It was a poisonous book. The heavy odour of incense seemed to cling about its pages and to trouble the brain. Don Lamb, for whom studying works of art has always been a sober, analytic process, finds himself deeply disturbed by Sickbed, poisoned even. But I'd suggest that this reaction masks a deeper, unacknowledged fascination. If Sickbed is one catalyst for Don's awakening, then there are other stealthier influences at work. He's closely guided in all he does by an older mentor, a fellow Peterhouse academic called Valentine Black, or Val, a figure whose intentions take on a darker, more sinister aspect as the tale progresses. Val, incidentally, is himself a distinctly Wildean type, that of the dandy, and specifically the dandy whose cultivation belies an ordinary, even lowly background. Compare Jack Worthing in The Importance of Being Earnest. Of Val, we're told early on that his mood, his whims, his worship of tradition and disdain for new trends, his meticulous manners and occasional lack of manners, all express the character of the college. He refers to himself as the Queen of Peterhouse. And by the way, while none of the characters in Tiepolo Blue, or in fact either of my novels, is based on real-life individuals, one point of reference, I suppose, for Val's character was this man, the late David Watkin, a brilliant traditionalist architectural historian who was at Peterhouse from 1970 to 2008, and whose book, Morality and Architecture, published in 1977, was almost radical in its conservatism, seeking to dismantle all the arguments used to support modernist architecture. And I did meet him just the once, at a party not unlike this, where I made the mistake of telling him how very much I admired the concrete modernist buildings on London's South Bank. Let's just say he wasn't impressed. At Val's encouragement, Don agrees to appear on BBC Radio 4 to air his views on Sickbed. Don speaks his mind freely, far too freely, and is effectively cancelled, as we'd say today. His disastrous radio appearance precipitates his departure from Cambridge. He leaves to take up the directorship of a small suburban museum in South London, somewhere not unlike Dulwich Picture Gallery. And it's in Dulwich too, amid the green spaces and neo-Gothic architecture of suburban South London, that his awakening truly begins. An awakening that's also an unravelling, because increasingly the restraint of Don's former life gives way to an excess of sensation. He takes up a new role, as I say, but his change in life is propelled by an encounter with a young artist called Ben, who befriends him, draws him out of himself, introduces him to new places and experiences, including the contemporary art scene of the time. It was that very special, dynamic moment in the London art world when the so-called YBAs, or Young British Artists, were coming to prominence. We saw their work, with the work of a few of them just a moment ago. Ben also introduces Don, crucially, to the gay scene. They go on a trip together to Soho that has, for Don, the lurid, dreamlike intensity of a descent into the underworld. Over the course of a long, hot summer, Don steps decisively out of the persona, the rigid ideals that used to define him. Even as his life, in many respects, falls apart, he sees and feels things that he never has before. At the open-air swimming pool or Lido of Brockwell Park, which becomes a favourite haunt, he perceives the blue of Tiepolo's frescoes, the colour that has always fascinated him, all around him. The colour has broken from the confines of art into the world. Beauty goes from being a measurable quality in a picture to a protean one that defies encapsulation. Or, as Wilde put it in The Critic as Artist, something that has as many meanings as man has moods. Beauty reveals everything because it expresses nothing. When it shows itself, it shows us the whole fiery coloured world. Don Lamb is subject to a variety of influences, as I've described, but the story is also about the resurgence in him of a spirit that has always lain dormant. New thoughts and sensations aren't so much poured into him as coaxed out of him. Influence involves a conjunction of external forces and inner instinct, the kindling of innate potential. This brings me back once more to the very nature of influence, an idea that finds dramatic expression in my second novel, The Violet Hour, which came out in February. Here, the main character is an artist called Thomas Haller. A reticent, sombre individual, Thomas is a globally renowned abstract painter. Cahill was the successor to Mark Rothko for ethereal paintings, a little like this, or this. And yet, mysteriously, he has retreated from the New York art world, the scene of his greatest successes, to live in a modernist house of his own design in the landscape where he was brought up, the mountains above Lake Geneva. Overlooking the town of Montreux, the house is its own private world, an ultra-refined monastery. A view of the town and the lake opened up beneath him. This place was beautiful, he thought, in a way that defied expression. Wherever else he'd gone, Montreux and its surroundings had remained his home. The name came from monasteriolum, meaning little monastery, a place to live alone. 6 years earlier, when he finally became rich enough, he'd carved his wedge of glass and concrete and zinc into the side of the mountain. We come to realise that Thomas, for all his wealth and renown, has reached an impasse, a crisis. On the eve of a major comeback show in London, he feels like a fraud. He has abandoned his long-term art dealer, Lorna, for a bigger, glitzier dealer, and that act of abandonment gradually makes sense as we gain a window into his and Lorna's shared pasts. The time 20 years earlier when they were art students together in London, and then Thomas's growing infatuation with an older man, and the way that that infatuation has moulded his personality, shaped the course of his life. Through Thomas's flashbacks, as he wanders around his Swiss hideaway, we learn how he first met this man, a powerful art dealer in Dusseldorf, after coming to live in Germany in the late 1990s. And I'm going to read a sequence of excerpts that trace the origins of their relationship. Claude Berlin's was one of the few dealers of modern art in the city. His street-level gallery on Plattenenstrasse mainly showed European paintings and drawings of the early 20th century, but it had begun to represent contemporary artists. The first exhibition Thomas saw there was a series of gouache studies by Alexander Rodchenko, orbs and oblongs flying off course from ruled lines, reminding him of cable cars. Claude had a ruthless kind of humour that tipped sometimes into mockery. He knew how to seize hold of a conversation, switching with ease between German and English and French. His voice was drawlingly smooth, his lips surprisingly full for his plain face. He often wore a black jacket with a sheen to it. Later, Thomas would learn the name of its designer. Claude seemed indifferent to the young art student at first. Then his eyes began to settle on Thomas from across the room, rarely for more than a fleeting moment. Sometimes the two of them would exchange remarks about the art on the walls, Thomas struggling to find the right words before Claude's attention switched, inevitably, to the next person. Just once, Thomas was conscious of Claude putting an arm around his shoulders. One night, Claude opened an exhibition of paintings by Sonia Delane. Thomas was among the last people at the party. By a trick of words, Claude contrived to make the others depart. He invited Thomas upstairs into a cavernous room. Art was everywhere, hanging on the walls, stacked against the skirting boards, most of it abstract. The floorboards were dark with varnish. A curtain hung over the single window. There was a large bed at one end, spread over with a tapestry. On one of the walls was a Jean Arc pen drawing, a mesh of talking lines, swerving like a net in the wind. As they stood together in front of it, Thomas's heart thudded with drugs and anticipation. Guided by the sweep of the lines, their eyes met. They looked at one another, and Thomas gave Claude his hands. Claude held them tight, pulled him close. Well, what follows is one of the novel's more baroque sex scenes, and it might be a little early in the day to read on. What this marks, in any case, is the beginning of a love affair, a powerfully intense love affair. They see each other every night. Claude's bedroom above the gallery becomes its own enlivening, claustrophobic world, a place more real for Thomas than anywhere else. And Claude begins to declaim to Thomas, as they're lying in bed together, about what sort of artist he should be. Forget about images, Claude says. They're sentimental. Abstraction is where your future lies. Let colour be your subject, and form and tonality. These are the absolutes in art. Everything else is fashion. And you want to be more than a fashionable painter, don't you? You want to be great. So begins a long, insidious process of Claude forming Thomas into the kind of man, the kind of artist that Claude wants. Or, to turn it around, the process of Thomas attending to Claude's edicts, internalising them, making them the principles by which he lives. Even as it happened, Thomas was conscious that Claude was shaping him, sculpting his manners and opinions. Involuntarily, he began to speak with Claude's leisurely delivery. He spoke in English more often and picked up on Claude's habit of refusing to give way when another person talked. Gradually, Claude turned him into an aficionado of abstract art. Thomas grew familiar with the arguments of Greenberg and Rosenberg. He echoed and learned to feel Claude's contempt for Andy Warhol and other trickster image makers. The seduction of Thomas by Claude is perhaps the key resonance between The Violet Hour and the writing of Wilde, invoking, as it does, the relationship in the Picture of Dorian Gray between the young Dorian and the older, worldlier Lord Henry Wotton. And please indulge my reliance here on stills from a couple of the wonderful or wonderfully awful film adaptations of Wilde's novel. At their first meeting in the rose-scented studio of Basil Hallward, Lord Henry professes to Dorian on the immoral nature of influence as he sees it, arguing that to influence a person is to give him one's own soul. He does not think his natural thoughts or burn with his natural passions. He becomes an echo of someone else's music. It seems at times in Wilde's novel that this is precisely what happens between Lord Henry and Dorian, the older man pouring his thoughts and passions into the vacant shell of the younger man. Not long after their initial meeting, Lord Henry reflects to himself that talking to him was like playing upon an exquisite violin. He answered to every touch and thrill of the bow. There was something terribly enthralling in the exercise of influence. No other activity was like it. To project one's soul into some gracious form and let it tarry there for a moment. To hear one's own intellectual views echoed back to one with all the added music of passion and youth. to convey one's temperament into another, as though it were a subtle fluid or a strange perfume. There was a real joy in that. In The Violet Hour, the influence of the older Claude is at many levels like that of Lord Henry, a sustained attempt to shape another person in one's own image. But for the young Thomas Haller, Claude's influence, which is erotic as well as psychological, is something to be grappled with, transformed, even resisted. Indeed, the story of The Violet Hour, its tragedy even, ultimately has to do with Thomas's attempt in middle age to outgrow the influence of the person who had seemed to define him, even if that means breaking out of the artistic persona, the painterly style that has made him who he is. And indeed, in the Picture of Dorian Gray, it's clear that Dorian is not merely a cipher, not simply a creation of Lord Henry's, for all that Lord Henry might like to regard himself as a modern-day Pygmalion. Dorian has agency, autonomy, far beyond what Lord Henry can ordain or manipulate. He might take up some of Lord Henry's views, just as Wilde took up those of Walter Pater, but he runs with them, enacts them, perhaps even produces them. Wilde goes to some lengths to stress what is innate in Dorian. Take this important early passage from when Dorian is still being painted after he's first met Lord Henry. For nearly 10 minutes he stood there, motionless, with parted lips and eyes strangely bright. He was dimly conscious that entirely fresh influences were at work within him, yet they seemed to him to have come really from himself. The few words that Basil's friend had said to him, words spoken by chance, no doubt, and with willful paradox in them, had touched some secret chord that had never been touched before, but that he felt was now vibrating and throbbing to curious pulses. Whatever influence Lord Henry has, Dorian is darkly aware of the, quote, still more poisonous influences that came from his own temperament. Some way into the story, as Dorian lives his life of extravagant pleasure, we're told how he habitually wanders through the picture gallery of his country house, studying the portraits of his ancestors, wondering to what degree he has inherited their traits. Looking at the portrait of a dissolute Jacobean forebear, Dorian wonders, had some strange poisonous germ crept from body to body till it had reached his own? The implication here, as elsewhere, is that Dorian's nature, from his love of beauty through to his capacity for cruelty, is complex and composite. It's congenital, potentially, just as much as something that's been cultivated. What for me makes Dorian Gray a fascinating character is that, for all his nastiness, he does have self-awareness, or moments of it, a recurring apprehension of the tragedy of his own soul. And I'd say, in fact, that he has far more of a capacity for introspection than Lord Henry, who at times can seem like a walking collection of epigrams. In the end, Dorian strikes out against those who have influenced him, against Basil Hallward, whom he stabs to death, and against Lord Henry, whom he tires of, a subtler form of rebuttal, admittedly. And his reaction against those two men demonstrates the operation of his will, his conscience, his subjectivity. In The Violet Hour, in a slightly different way, Thomas absorbs Claude's influence, but then synthesizes it with his own ideas about what art should be. We learn in the course of the story that Thomas is anything but the artist he appears, that there are impulses and desires at work in him, secrets from his past that have nothing to do with Claude. The high abstract style that he has adopted is, in fact, a kind of veil, concealing that secret inner reality. Reading my own story through the lens of Wilde's allows me to see, with new clarity, how I was probing the whole concept of influence, what it means to exercise it and to absorb it, how influence is rarely, if ever, a one-way process, how acting upon another's influence, even transforming it into something distinct, is a creative act. And as a model in all this for the artistic process itself, for my own relationship, even, with Wilde. I should perhaps come clean here and admit that I wasn't thinking in any very direct way about the Picture of Dorian Gray when I wrote the story of Claude and Thomas, which is just one strand of the larger narrative of the Violet Hour. And I think if I had, I probably would have patterned the events of my story too closely, too self-consciously, according to Wilde's. I wouldn't have been able to avoid pastiche. And yet, I have no doubt that Wilde's novel was a profound influence. Just as Basil Hallward said of Dorian, he is never more present in my work than when no image of him is there. This again reveals something, I think, of the nature of artistic influence, its largely subliminal operation. Wilde, at least in The Critic as Artist, expressed scepticism as to whether artists ever work in an unconscious way. He states, or his character Gilbert states, that all fine imaginative work is self-conscious and deliberate. There is no fine art without self-consciousness, and self-consciousness and the critical spirit are one. But I suspect that this is one of the propositions that Wilde himself didn't really believe, and certainly his critical writings are full of such propositions, thought experiments rather than avowed principles. Because the very contrast between unconscious and intentional modes of artistic influence was, as we've seen, one that Wilde pondered, one that he dramatised. He knew, more than many, what it is to operate between conscious and unconscious thought, between explicit meanings and covert ones, between surface and depth. He knew too what it is to invert what's generally meant by surface and depth, so that the surface becomes the place of mystery. The true mystery of the world is the visible, says Lord Henry to Dorian, not the invisible. And this is an idea I've returned to all the way through my novels, perhaps above all in relation to the house, the domestic habitat of a given character. In Tiepolo Blue, it transpires that Don's old friend and mentor, the older Professor Valentine Black, has an elegant detached house in Dulwich that he rarely uses. It's here that Don comes to stay, following his ejection from Cambridge. Val's house is like a fantasy, soft lit, lined with silk, filled with French furniture and small masterpieces of Italian mannerism. Don walks in a kind of trance past fragments of ancient statuary, Egyptian, Greek, Roman, Syrian, and tapestries woven with chivalric tales. The place throbs with taste and cultivation. The glut of periods and styles is topped off by references to Val's adopted faith, a portrait of Cardinal Newman, a silver crucifix spread-eagled on a panel of blood-red velour, a rosary that has been draped like a necklace around a plaster cast of Antinous. In a knowing riff on both Wilde and Walter Pater, Val calls his home the House Beautiful. It's a work of art in its own regard, a way of displaying persona, or more particularly of displaying the mystery of persona, its multifaceted and mutable nature. Depth and surface are collapsed together, with elaborate surfaces standing for depth of experience, for subtlety of subjectivity. The longer he stays at the house, the more unnerved Don becomes by the sense of a quasi-human presence. The House Beautiful is preying on his mind. In the sum of its parts, it is just that, beautiful, exquisite. Everything about the place, the furniture, pictures and objects, is so right, so unimpeachable, a model of decorum. Yet there is a lurking germ, a discordant note, almost imperceptible. The shimmering lacquered cabinet, the champagne tint of the oval mirror, the plaster bust of Antinous with its rosary necklace like black beetles in single file. There is something wayward in these charming details. He tries to define it whenever he catches glimpses. On every ascent or descent of the stairs, he looks back at the black cabinet on the half landing. In the gleaming surface, his reflection dissolves into dabs and flecks, scattered like petals on the surface of a pond. He begins to wonder if Ben was right about the house. he has the growing sense that the place has somehow been contrived, made up like a stage set to disarm him. Val has kept it for decades as a kind of shrine. How little you knew, the older man seems to be saying through the silent media of French polish and finely cracked paint. How little you knew about any of this. In Val's house, then, we have an embodiment of persona, the very sort of multiform persona that Wilde assigns to Dorian Gray, or has Dorian assigned to himself. We're told how Dorian used to wonder at the shallow psychology of those who conceive the ego in man as a thing simple, permanent, reliable, and of one essence. To him, man was a being with myriad lives and myriad sensations, a complex, multiform creature that bore within itself strange legacies of thought and passion. The House Beautiful in Tiepolo Blue is a way of externalizing the personality in all its flux and complexity. Surfaces are synonymous with depth of meaning. Wilde pursued such an idea in the creation of his own house on Tite Street. He also recognised it in the homes of others. For example, his friends Charles Ricketts and Charles Shannon, key figures in the aesthetic movement, whose Chelsea home he described as the one house in London where you will never be bored and where you will not be asked to explain things. Nothing should be explained. In The Violet Hour, too, Thomas's arch-modernist house functions as its own explanation, as an externalization of the self, but equally as a casting of the self into a certain guise. Midway through the story, Thomas finds himself guiding a young filmmaker through his house, a woman called Mariana Berger, who has come to shoot a documentary about him. And really, much of what we discover about his personality is through her eyes. I was saying just before lunch that the novel, you don't need to know this, but it's partly modelled on the film Sunset Boulevard. And Mariana is a little bit like the Joe Gillis character, who goes to Thomas's house to find out about him, or we learn about him through her. And as he takes her through the house, he muses. The carpet underfoot was dark and deep. The ceiling and outer wall of the corridor had been hewn to a glassy lustre. The inner wall was faced in stained teak. The doors occurred at measured intervals, each one a constructivist marquetry of bronze and steel segments. He remembered the drawings for those doors, the endless revisions. There was so much as a visitor to this place that you could never know. To her, it was nothing but veneers, a sensory experience rather than the product of time and love and patience and money. The expense had almost ruined him. It was like looking at a person, he guessed, with no comprehension of the long progression of their life. With dull wonder, he reflected on the fact that he had never allowed Claude here. He had created this place even as a retreat from the world that Claude represented. And yet, the gorgeous surfaces, every varnished panel and stretch of carpet, those 6 paintings of oxidized gold were a demonstration to Claude, a way of saying, look what I've become. For Thomas, the opulent interiors of his house are a way of displaying himself to himself, a means of descending into the depths of his memories and desires, but equally a way of projecting a certain image, of holding himself at a remove. It's impossible in the end to separate the masks that he wears, of which the house is perhaps the most elaborate example, from the essence of him. He is a man made up of masks. We're told in the Picture of Dorian Gray that Dorian's copious, exquisite textiles and ecclesiastical garments, quote, were to be to him a means of forgetfulness, mode by which he could escape for a season from the fear that seemed to him at times to be almost too great to be borne. And I think that for Thomas Haller, too, in his modernist layer, the house is simultaneously a staging of self and a distraction from self. In the Picture of Dorian Gray, Wilde explicitly characterises Dorian through Lord Henry's eyes as a living work of art. Now and then, a complex personality took the place and assumed the office of art. was indeed, in its way, a real work of art, life having its elaborate masterpieces just as poetry has, or sculpture, or painting. And throughout the story, that real work of art, that complex personality, enacts its own influence, even as it's directed by external forces. Certainly, Wilde was fascinated by what we might nowadays call the work of art's agency, its capacity to elicit meanings regardless of what the artist intended. As he professed in The Critic as Artist, who again cares whether Mr. Pater has put into the portrait of Mona Lisa something that Leonardo never dreamed of? Criticism does not confine itself, let us at least suppose for the moment, to discovering the real intention of the artist and accepting that as final. The role of the viewer in imparting meaning in the manner of a critic is an idea I return to throughout my two novels, both overtly at the level of each story and more fundamentally in terms of how I think about the novel once it's written, as a text that other people are going to bring interpretations to. At the beginning of Tiepolo Blue, Don imposes meaning on Tiepolo's frescoes in a way that reduces them, shuts down possibilities. Later, once his senses and perceptions have been given free rein, he interprets life with a ranging intensity, a depth of imagination that I think is fundamentally truer of how we relate to works of art. In both novels, I've avoided trying to explain everything away. Indeed, I think one of the strengths of the novel as a genre is that you don't have to. There's no need to explain what art is, say, in the way that an academic might seek to. Ultimately, if I think about my debt to Oscar Wilde, what it means to talk about Wildean resonances, we have to move away from mere plot points. What I've suggested in this talk is that I believe that influence in literature goes far beyond the conscious modelling of one story on another, or finite allusions to given characters or settings, the sorts of things that Wilde himself would probably have decried as imitation over invention. If anything, it's Wilde's underlying sense of the nature of influence, the ways in which we respond to art, that has inspired me, together with his insistence, one of the few things he really insisted on, that no creative work should be subordinated to a moral purpose. No artist has ethical sympathies, Wilde writes in the preface to the Picture of Dorian Gray. An ethical sympathy in an artist is an unpardonable mannerism of style. It's one of his classic epigrams, indeed every line of that preface is. And like so much of what he said, its levity of expression, its almost throwaway nature, masks its seriousness of import. It's not the same as saying a novel should be bereft of ethical content, void of any idea of what it means to act ethically or unethically. Indeed, the Picture of Dorian Gray is profoundly interested in those questions, and in defending the novel against attacks that it was immoral, Wilde even spoke of its ethical beauty. In terms of how it ends, the narrative has a moral shape, an ethical design, if not a didactic intent. It's a novel that evokes human lives in all their pain, darkness, contradiction, and comedy, but refuses to hit you over the head with its author's principles. If the same were ever to be said of one of my own books, I'd be very glad, because I can think of no better Wildean resonance. Thank you very much. And I can also, by the way, think of no better moment if you haven't got a copy of one of these novels for you to buy them, because they are not only discounted to £15 for the Violet Hour and £5 for Tiepolo Blue, but I, of course, am available to sign them. Would be very happy to do that for anybody.
Thank you. Good. One. I notice your choice of name, by the way. God is a very Don is a very good name, and what is it, the tautology of the name Don? Yes, I do approve of that. I'd like to be associated with a man who loves a house throbbing with taste, beautiful house throbbing with taste. And I like to be associated with that sort of thing rather than ducks. So thank you very much. You gave us a wonderfully telling succession of wild poets. I think they were brilliantly chosen and brilliantly put together in a sequence. And you showed influences on your writing in such an exact and sharp focus. It was really quite a dazzling, as was your run through of the stories of the books. I thought it all might be a spoiler, but it's not a spoiler. What it is a wonderful encouragement to get to read the book. Personal confession, I started reading Tiepolo Blue, but I haven't got very far yet, just lack of time. But I'm hooked, really hooked already. You put things, to express the way in which they can be seen, sharpness of focus and the sharpness of understanding, rather like the hallucinatory qualities of an LSD experience, I think. We've got a lot of that there. So, James, that was a wonderful exposition of the nature of influence. Not a one-way process, and no, not pastiche either. James, you take your place in our list of dazzling speakers over the years, and you are really the most wonderful one among them, totally enthralling from beginning to